Great. I hope that your coaching groups went well and got to know each other a little bit more and focused on the word from your coaches. And so, yes, thank you for sharing at that time. As I noted at the beginning, we are now going to go into a little time of content and a bit about our research from Sticky Faith. We have Jake Mulder here, who is an author of Growing Young, but Jake is also the Assistant Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller Seminary. That's a new title for Jake, and so I'm kind of getting used to actually saying that, Jake. But he is also still connected with us at Fuller Youth Institute, and so grateful for his leadership. And so, Jake, this is our 2023 Growing Young cohort, and we're grateful that you're here. So we'd love for you to share a little bit about Sticky Faith.
Thanks, Andy, and everybody. It's good to be with you. I am coming to you from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was in Southern California last week and lived in Southern California for a long time. And I'm just feeling the cold here. So for those of you who are also feeling the cold, which should be more people with this storm that's coming across the country, I'm walking with you through that. Now, quick technical question, because Andy, at the tail end of when you were talking, I started to get just a little bit of, the video got a little choppy. Can everybody hear me okay, or am I choppy right now? Okay, well, I'm going to assume it was either connection between Andy and me or whatever it is better now. So looking forward to this conversation with all of you. I have been a youth leader myself, spent several years in youth ministry, and then have been with the Fuller Youth Institute for about 11 years, which is crazy to have been with the Fuller Youth Institute for 11 years. By quick show of hands, before this cohort began, who had heard the phrase sticky faith before? Who you'd say before this? Okay, so most hands. Now, keep your hand up if you have actually read one of the Sticky Faith books cover to cover. Okay, I see some wavering hands. All right, that's helpful. Well, then the way that we have planned this is going to work very well, which is we're just going to give you a very short flyby overview to make sure that there's general familiarity. So if you have read the books before, I don't think that this will be completely redundant. If you've never read any of the Sticky Faith books, you should find this as kind of a helpful overview. If you can turn to page 6 in your handout or in your packet, that would be wonderful. It should say Sticky Faith Overview at the beginning. Okay, Sticky Faith Overview at the top of page 6 in your handout. Now, we're going in a bit of reverse order here. In that we've been talking about Growing Young, and we're going to take you into Sticky Faith. In the chronological timeline, Sticky Faith actually came first. And in Sticky Faith, which, boy, that book is 10 or 11 years old, which means the research started about 15 years ago, the pressing problem or challenge that we were looking at, and you'll see this at the top of your page, we're looking at the reality that 1 in 2 young people drift from the faith as they get into young adulthood. Now, 1 in 2 is a fairly simple way of saying it. That's at the low end of most estimates for what percentage of young people who grow up in the church end up drifting from the church and drifting from faith. But we were looking at this question, another way of saying it, and this is what I experienced as a youth leader. Why is it that I have all of these kids who are coming to middle school youth group or high school youth group who have, at least in my tradition, prayed the sinner's prayer like 8 different times by the time they're 19? Just found that out from my 8-year-old son the other day, that he is a few levels and layers deep into that. So how is it that those things are happening? And we have young people who are committed in that time period, but by the time they get into their college years or their young adult years are drifting. And so that's the research that I'm going to talk about. But what you'll notice is it's focused on teenagers and it's focused on their transition and what happens with their faith. Now, that study took place starting about 15 years ago. It was out of this study that Growing Young came about 5 years later, because we were doing so much work on sticky faith, and parents were finding sticky faith helpful, youth leaders were finding sticky faith helpful. Well, what that led us into was a question of saying, okay, well, if this is what helps a teenager's faith stick, then what do churches, what do ministries in terms of the larger culture and the larger system need to do? That's what led us into Growing Young. So when you think about Growing Young, think about the larger church culture, the larger church system. What do we need to do more broadly? Sticky Faith was much more focused on teenagers specifically and what happens to their faith. If that doesn't make sense, then I'm off to a bad start, and hopefully where I go from here will make a little bit more sense. The good news is that all of this is in a set of books and resources that you can engage with. So from here, let me move over and share some slides. I'm going to walk through this in probably 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Do feel free to add questions to the chat as they come to mind, and then we will make sure to engage them just a bit. Now, one thing that you hopefully notice is that our slides and design have gotten much better over the years. This is an original Sticky Face slide. It's not bad, but it's fairly straightforward, and it's got an old logo. When we think about Sticky Faith, one of the ways that we like to think about it is like a bridge, okay? We like to think of faith as a bridge. And part of what we're helping teenagers to do is construct a bridge that will help them cross that bridge with a faith that is robust, that is intact, and propels them into adulthood. The bad news, which is in our handout there, is that research shows 1 in 2 end up drifting from God, drifting from the faith after high school. That's a combination of studies. As this has progressed over time, it seems like the percentage is only increasing, that a lot of more recent estimates can put it as high as 70% of teenagers experience that drift. Now, that drift looks different for every young person. This does not mean that all of them leave the church, join a cult, never to return. And in fact, we use the word drift because drift is in fact what happens. Maybe if you've been in a boat before, you get out of the boat for a minute and you're not paying attention and the wind pushes that boat or floating object. Hopefully you haven't done this with one of your children in like a floating thing where you turn to the side and the wind, they kind of drift a little ways away from you. But what ends up happening with so many young people's faith is it's not just a single moment where they decide, well, I guess I'm not a Christian anymore. I guess it's that I don't go to church anymore. It happens bit by bit, almost imperceptibly, that by the point they actually get to, okay, so what do I believe and who or what do I affiliate with? That drift has taken place over a long enough period of time that they realize, yeah, I really don't think that I'm a Christian anymore. I really don't think that I engage with church in the same way that I did. We often hear from people, well, do they come back? And you may have gotten to this chapter in Growing Young. We may have given this presentation, but just in case not, the most common predictor of when teenagers who drifted would come back to the faith is when they got married and had kids. They were ready to settle down and join a church and raise their kids in the faith. The bad news is that, number one, young people are not getting married, having kids, and settling down in the same way that they did. The other part of the bad news is even when they do, we are not seeing the same sort of engagement with faith communities that we saw before. So will they come back? The answer is maybe. What we think we can all agree on is it would be much better to never lose young people from the church, for them to stay passionate and engaged and see a church or ministry as something meaningful, than for them to feel the need that maybe a faith community is not the place for me. This is articulated. One young person we spoke to in our study, Eli, said this, reflecting on his faith. He said, God is not the friend that God was in high school. God is more now like the grandparent that I only visit on holidays or special occasions. What's interesting to note is sometimes we might think, well, maybe those who drifted were planning to drift. They never really took their faith seriously. The reality is that 4 out of 5 who end up drifting intended to cross that bridge well. Another way to say that is, if you were to talk to them in high school and say, do you plan to find a church? Do you think your faith will shape who you are and the decisions you make? The vast majority will say yes. It's not that they said, my faith really isn't that important anyway. There's a variety of sticky faith resources. Some are geared for parents, some are geared for youth leaders. There are curriculum and Bible study. Feel free to talk to your coach. Most of those people who are coaching now started with the Fuller Youth Institute around some of the sticky faith resources. So if you need some customized recommendations, feel free to do that. Otherwise, there's a variety of sticky faith resources that can be helpful. This study overall is we were looking at 384 high school seniors from different regions of the US. And what we looked at was them in their senior year of high school and what happened to their faith in the few years after high school. So this was a quantitative study mixed with some interviews, some literature review. For those of you who really want to understand the research more, we talk about that in the book. But now I'm going to take you to the key takeaways. And one that I want to emphasize is, first of all, we say it's never too early to begin building sticky faith, but it's also never too late. The reason that we emphasize that is the moment that we start talking about teenagers and sticky faith, some people who are in children's ministry might say, oh, this isn't for me. I'll pass it along to the youth leader, whoever's responsible for teenagers. We think absolutely this starts at birth, or this starts even before birth with those who are eventually going to become those who shape the faith of young people. We also want to say it's never too late. If you are working with young adults, if you're working with 40-year-olds who maybe didn't have a positive experience of the faith, we think that these principles and these concepts can apply across the board. So what we're going to zero in on are 3 keys for building sticky faith. I will say, if you notice some overlap and some resonance with the principles in Growing Young, that is intentional, and it's what showed up in the research. What I really want you to think about is these are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. One side of the coin is we started by asking, what shapes a young person's faith? What helps them develop a faith that lasts? That was the sticky faith question. The Growing Young question is, well, what does an overall church do that helps young people develop a thriving faith? What does an overall church do that engages young people well? Those are related but distinct questions. So if you notice some overlap, it's because the research does reveal a fair amount of overlap. The first area that we talk about when it comes to building sticky faith is we need to consider a sticky gospel. We need to consider a sticky gospel. Now, when we think about a sticky gospel, we would say it is teaching, and this is teaching broadly speaking. This is not just a talk or a message that you give. It is all of the ways that you communicate that shapes a young person, but it's teaching that launches students towards lifelong faith. One of the key takeaways when we got into the research and we looked at what is it that young people believe is we would want young people's beliefs to become a core aspect of their identity. It's something that is so foundational to how they think of themselves that there's really no way you can untangle what they believe about Jesus with who they are and how they think about themselves. The bad news is that a lot of the young people that we talk to focused on their Christian beliefs in their faith like a jacket. And we came to talk about this as the Jesus jacket. The reason for that is that a jacket is something that you can take on. It's something you can put on, but it's also something that you can take off. And what we experienced from a variety of teenagers is that in certain situations, when they were with their Christian friends, when they were at youth group, they were very good at taking that jacket and putting it on and wearing the Christian identity. But the moment that they went to somewhere that was a different setting that maybe didn't reinforce those beliefs, the jacket would come off. They would have a different identity. Now, identity development, something for someone smarter than me to have a more robust conversation. Maybe we will give that one to Chuck. I think he did a doctorate in something related to that. But the simple way of saying it is that if we really want a faith to matter for young people, We don't want it as something disposable that they can take on or they can take off. We want it as something that informs all of who they are. Another way of saying that is a lot of young people end up treating faith like a set of beliefs, like a do list and a don't list. And if I do the things on the do list, the Christian things, well, then I'm a Christian. But if I do the things on the don't list, well, then I guess I'm not a Christian. And in that sense, their faith becomes very behavioralistic. And if they end up making mistakes, and if you know many teenagers or young adults, there are going to be a handful of missteps, backsteps, all that sort of thing. Many of them end up equating, because I did this thing, I must not be a Christian anymore. One author that we like to think about on this topic is Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard passed away a number of years ago. I know there's a number of faith traditions represented on this call. There are other theologians who I'm sure talk about this same concept, but from your tradition. Dallas Willard talks about the gospel of sin management. And what he ends up writing about is how many Christians, we end up treating Jesus as the solution to our sin problem. And since sin is going to send us to hell, well, if we believe in Jesus or we pray to Jesus, then Jesus keeps us out of hell, gets us into heaven. Now, depending on your theological tradition, the way that I said that might resonate. There's not anything inherently wrong in what I said. But what Dallas Willard says is Jesus, the gospel that Jesus proclaimed, was not believe in me so you can go to heaven. It was that the kingdom of God is here and that the kingdom of God is now. And what Dallas Willard says is the invitation of Jesus is an invitation that starts here and now, but of course has eternal and long-term implications to it. The short version of all of that is for a lot of young people who end up leaving, I'm going to put in quotes, leaving the Christian faith. They're not actually leaving the Christian faith. They're not leaving a robust belief and trust in Jesus. They are leaving some boiled down, simpler version of what they think Christianity to be. So let me move to a few practical implications, then I'll pause and see if there's any questions at this point. Some best practices that we think are helpful to help young people grasp the sticky gospel. The first one is just making sure that interactions are centered in grace. Okay, interactions are centered in grace. That's what we do as a church, what we do as a youth ministry, how we support parents. A lot of young people primarily experience the Christian faith as being a list of rules, do's, and don'ts. Many of them do not experience the radical grace that is demonstrated by Jesus. And if at its core, this belief of grace and forgiveness and acceptance is part of what makes Christianity different from all other faiths, we want that to be the primary thing that young people come to know the Christian faith for. The second one of a much longer list that we could offer is to make sure that you are welcoming doubts in your ministry. The sort of Christian faith that I grew up in was very much you have to have an answer for every single aspect of what you believe. And for many youth leaders, I spent a lot of time training my youth leaders on apologetics and making sure that if a young person asks a question about dinosaurs or whatever it is, that you've got a ready response so that young people don't end up doubting their faith. Well, the opposite ends up being true, that when young people can experience a version of the Christian faith that is large enough and centered on Jesus and flexible enough to walk with them through their doubts, that ends up being a faith that is often more robust to make it into their young adult years. So let me pause here real quick. I'm going to check the chat. So far, I see one question from Zach, and that is it. Please put your questions in. I'll pause for just about a minute. Anybody want to comment or ask anything about this idea of the sticky gospel? Any comments or questions on the sticky gospel? For anybody, all the coaches on this group are top notch, but for anybody who's with Keegan, I am particularly excited for you because I feel like Keegan has the best stories on sticky face. So if you're in Keegan's group, ask him to tell you some sticky face stories. But anybody, if you want to unmute, any questions or comments on this idea of the sticky gospel?
just one back to your research ones. Of those high school students that you interviewed, did you track to see which post-secondary institutions they went to, and if that made a difference on them sticking to their faith?
Great question. So that was not a part of this research design, but Steve Argue, who is a faculty member at Fuller, and I am sure you're going to get to hear from Steve at some point in the coming year if you haven't already. Steve's research was on college campuses, and he was looking at secular universities and Christian universities. And I'll let Steve talk about this more, but if many of us hold the idea that if our students go to secular universities, that's where they're going to lose their faith, there's a lot of research that actually debunks that. And as a kid who grew up going to Christian schools and then went to a public university, I'll offer some anecdotal backup to that. So again, ask Steve that question. It's one that he can speak to with quite a bit of expertise. Let me move over to our other 2 points. And then again, feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll make sure that we have time to address those. The second key theme that we want to look at here is this idea of a sticky church, which is helping adults get out of their seats and involved in kids' lives. One of the best practices in many traditions of youth ministry is that we actually created a 2-table church. Now, this is not a photo of my family. This is a picture of Brad Griffin's family at Thanksgiving. Brad Griffin is a co-author on Sticky Faith. And again, at Thanksgiving or Christmas, you might have a traditional setup to what many people do, which is you have an adults table and then you have a kids table. The adults table is where you have like the real glass plates, maybe fine china, depending on what your sort of setting is for dinner and meals. The kids table is, you'll notice this is it's a portable table with plastic cups, paper plates, and let's just say the mood is a little different than it is by the adults table. Well, I will say in many ways by design, many of our churches have modeled this where we've got kind of adults church over here, and then we've got children's, youth, young adult activities over here. And the idea is that we're having very age siloed and segregated experiences of church. There are very good reasons why that was set up that I'm not going to fully go into now. But what I will say is, as we've reflected on that after several decades of practice, here's the challenge. The way that we actually socialize young people into the Christian faith is by surrounding them with people of different ages and experiences who model what that Christian faith looks like. The challenge becomes, if we take young people and give them isolated, targeted faith experiences apart from senior adults and other adults in their lives, we actually sever one of the strongest connections of what models the Christian faith for them. In our Sticky Faith research, we ran a variety of youth group variables, and we found the strongest correlations of long-term faith happen to be around intergenerational relationships and intergenerational worship. Again, the strongest predictor, the strongest correlations of those young people who had a lasting faith or a sticky faith were if they participated in intergenerational worship or had intergenerational relationships. Hear me clearly. We are not saying you should cut all children's and youth ministry activity. We do think there is a time and a place for age and stage specific ministry, but we think that that being the default or that being the exclusive experience that young people have of the faith is not the best way to do it. Instead, what we're talking about is creating a new 5-to-1 ratio. We talk about this in Growing Young as well, that instead of having one adult for every 5 kids in your church as a chaperone, we want to flip that on its head to have 5 adults for every 1 kid. Okay, so flipping that ratio on its head. That does not mean you have to have 5 Sunday school teachers. It does not mean you have to have 5 small group leaders for every kid. It's in your church. Does every young person know that there are 5 adults who are supportive of them, who are on their team? I'll give you a quick sense of what that can look like in terms of best practices and ideas. One is simply learning names. For every young person in the church, are there 5 adults in that church who know the name of that young person? Another approach is exploring intergenerational classes. This is where, for those of you with Keegan as your coach, and maybe just later in the day or a different day, let Keegan tell some of his intergenerational stories, because they're some of the highlights that I usually tell when Keegan is not on the call, but Keegan is here, so I can't tell his stories. Intergenerational classes is just that, letting those from different ages be in some classes together to see what they can learn from each other. Similarly, intergenerational service trips, local service opportunities, international or national trips. Are there ways that you can pursue those as intergenerational activities? Similarly, for intergenerational worship, this does not mean all worship all the time is intergenerational. That might be right for your church, but are there ways that you can experiment or have portions of your worship where you begin to experiment with an intergenerational approach? The last is with intergenerational mentoring. I could talk about this one, but it's from the movie Up. Just watch that, and I normally don't need to say anymore. Many of us speak the language of Pixar. The last one that I want to talk about here in terms of keys of building sticky faith is sticky families. Now, if we had more time, I would invite each of you to chat in the words, feelings that come to mind when you as youth workers think about parents. And I would also do the flip side, asking parents what words, feelings, or thoughts come to your mind when you think about youth workers. Too often, if we're honest, youth workers don't see parents as key partners in their ministry, but they can see them as neutral or oftentimes kind of in the way of what youth workers are trying to do. And if we're honest, oftentimes parents do not view youth leaders as great partners. Sticky Faith has been an advocate for the partnership between parents and churches and parents and youth leaders for a while. So I'd like to think or hope that that has changed some from where it was a few years ago. But the reality is, when it comes to faith formation, Christian Smith led the National Study of Youth and Religion, the largest study that's been done on what young people in the US believe. And he made this statement: when it comes to kids' faith, parents get what they are. When it comes to kids' faith, parents get what they are. Another way to say that is that the strongest spiritual influence in the life of a child is that child's parent or a grandparent or whoever functions as that primary caregiver. A youth leader who we do a lot of work with, David Fraze, said it this way to a group of his parents: we can't out-teach what you teach at home. We are not that good. Now, David was pointing to the fact that youth leaders get about this much time every week with a young person, or sometimes this much time every month, whereas parents, grandparents, primary caregivers, simply the time differential completely outweighs what youth leaders have. Now, we do want to offer a grain of salt on this. We always have people who respond and say, but wait a second, I didn't grow up in a Christian home and an influential teacher or youth leader transformed my life. Yes, that happens. We don't want to discount that. That is very important. Your ministry should be reaching out to non-Christian kids. We think that even those who identify as Christian have other important influences in their life. It is just statistically across the board, study after study affirms the outsized role that parents and caregivers have in faith formation. One way of thinking about this research is that parents will get what they are. The twist on that: parents get what their kids think they are. It is the young people's perception more than what is intended by the parents. Here's another research twist. It's just as important as parents asking questions is parents who share their own experiences. So a lot of the Christian parenting books will tell you and drill you with the questions you need to ask your teenager or your young person. Equally as important to asking questions is that young people actually see and experience adults who are sharing about their own experiences. A few quick ideas that go along with this. If you're not in adult education in your church, look for ways you can partner with your adult ed. If you are in youth ministry or children's ministry, are there ways that you can actually partner with those who are educating and training the parents in your church? Hey, we're back to the G word, grace. look for ways that you can lavish grace on the parents in your church and in your ministry. There is a lot of guilt that can come toward Christian parents. A lot of Christian parents get the sense that they are not doing it very well. The more you can offer that acceptance and grace towards parents, models what they should be pointing towards the young people in their ministry. A couple others is just thinking about your ministry calendar and making sure that you are developing friendly rhythms toward parents. If you are a church where you have children's ministry activities that take place on this side of town, this night of the week, and other activities that take place the same time, but on the other side of the week, you may not be very friendly in the way that you are doing this, okay? Lisette or others may be able to talk about some of those, especially when you get into some medium and larger size church. We do think parent training can be a very effective way to do this. If you just happen to throw out parent training is happening, you may not get very good turnout. We'd recommend offer training during times of transition, middle school into high school into college, when parents are unsure or afraid. Don't be afraid to call your training mandatory. It happens in many other areas that training is mandatory and parents show up. Take advantage of the last 30 minutes of events. And then the last one, talk about things that parents care about, like technology, sex, and other topics. Here's the last one, actually, that I'm going to cover. Last idea: train parents to share their spiritual journey. We worked with one youth leader. The youth leader saw this and decided to go back to their youth group and ask the 20 students in their youth ministry, how many of you know your parents' testimony? How many of you know how your parents became Christian? 0 out of 20 hands in the room went up. One of the ways that we can partner with parents is by helping them understand and make sense of their own faith and creating space where they can share that faith with the young people who are in their sphere of influence. Now, again, I just want to give one shout out. You have multiple coaches who have incredible experience living this stuff out. So while I wanted to kind of set the table at a high level, please ask your coach for feedback on this. Zach or Andy, I think we're at time, but you tell me how we're doing.
Jake, you got a question from Dagmar, and would love for you to comment on that.
Yep. So I'll read it for everybody. Found the analogy by the young person, said faith was like a parent, but now like a grandparent that they visit a couple times a year. Very interesting. Grandparents seem to me to more than just frequency of connecting to their faith. Do you think it's also indicating that young people feel like it is outdated or irrelevant to their everyday life? Yeah. I'll offer a quick response here. What's fascinating is, despite the decline of church attendance and institutional affiliation, so many of the measures of faith, prayer, interest in the Bible, interest in Jesus are still high among young people. So that would be referred to broadly as spirituality. We find young people broadly don't think Jesus is outdated. They think faith is important to make sense of their life. It's often the container or the ways of engaging in that faith. And I will say this: if you are a grandparent or if you're in touch with grandparents, there is also some research out there that points to the outsized influence in a positive way that grandparents can have, and that with parents being busier or more frazzled or trying to keep up on things and grandparents actually stepping in, that faithful grandparent can in fact be an incredibly formative influence rather than being outdated or irrelevant to everyday life.
Great.
I'm not seeing any other questions. So Andy, I was going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jake, for jumping on with us and for the great content that you shared with us about sticky faith. Right now, we want to jump into just a quick stretch break. I know that we are just a few minutes off time, but do want to give you a 2 minutes to kind of get up out of your seat, move around, and take a break for just a couple of minutes before we introduce Scott and the content that he's going to be sharing with us. So